It's worth noting that while, yes, all 9 justices ruled that he should remain on the ballot in Colorado and everywhere else, they didn't make a decision about the question of insurrection and whether or not he engaged in it. This essentially was a decision that said it's not up to individual states. It's up to Congress.
Yeah, exactly right. Donald Trump had one of the reasons that folks thought going in that he was likely to win this case was he had a lot of different ways to win it. One of those ways was the court could have said, hey, he didn't actually engage in insurrection. The court went a different direction, instead said the power to take him off the ballot, the states don't have that power. As you said, it's up to Congress to decide how to enforce the insurrection clause.
What is the actual argument here, the insurrection clause that was written after the Civil War? This was intended to keep Confederates from holding office, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it says that somebody who served in the government, either state or federal, took an oath to support the Constitution and then engaged in insurrection, those are key words, can't then take office again. And so the question was, does that apply in this circumstance that nobody was really thinking about at the time of the 14th Amendment, but in the circumstance where Donald Trump allegedly incited the January 6th riot?
Well, and of course, we heard Trump heralding this decision from the court at Mar-a-Lago earlier today. He also pointed, though, to another case the court will have to decide that pertains to him, and that's his immunity question here in Washington, whether or not he is immune from prosecution as a former president in Jack Smith's 2020 election subversion case. Those arguments are scheduled for April 22nd. Should we draw a line between the timeline it took for the court to hear arguments and then rule in this case to a similar timeline potentially in that case, or was because of the deadline, Colorado's primary being tomorrow, that this happened so quickly?
I wouldn't assume that the court will decide that case as quickly as it decided this case. Here, we had Super Tuesday. As Joe said, pretty unusual to get word on a Sunday that the court's going to issue opinions on Monday. And this wasn't a day where they were normally scheduled to take the bench. And in fact, this opinion was not handed down from the bench. It was handed out just on the court's website and hard copies in the press office. So they clearly were trying to meet that deadline of Super Tuesday. With the immunity case, yes, there's a focus on the election, whether there will be a trial and a verdict before the election. But the court doesn't have any sort of immediate deadline like that would prompt them to say, oh, we need to get a ruling out by such and such date.
Yeah, thanks for helping us understand, as always. Greg Stohr getting us started here on Balance of Power. Meantime, former President Trump picking up more delegates in the Republican primary, even as Nikki Haley wins her first race. It happened over the weekend. This as the candidates prepare to face off in tomorrow's Super Tuesday races, a major stop on the road to the White House here. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Nancy Cook for more now. There's a lot of talk, Nancy, on Nikki Haley's last stand, essentially, tomorrow. The math is going to become very difficult for her if the polls are correct.
Absolutely. What we have to remember is that one of the reasons Super Tuesday is such a big deal is that more than a third of the delegates that a candidate needs to clinch the Republican nomination are awarded tomorrow night. And that includes in very large states like California. We are expecting Donald Trump to, really sweep those states. And that will put him, he won't clinch the nomination officially after tomorrow. But if he does as well as we expect, it will make the path for her to get the nomination basically impossible. The only contest that she's won so far has been in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, 1,215 delegates are needed. The math just doesn't dictate that Trump could secure them tomorrow, but he very well could by the time March is out. Is there, though, any number we should look at that would suggest that the former president's candidacy may be in more trouble in a general election scenario should he be the Republican nominee? Is there a margin that would suggest trouble for him in the Republican base?
I wouldn't say that sort of the delegate count or what he, how much he wins by a margin will suggest his vulnerabilities. I think that we can see the vulnerabilities in a lot of the polling that we have seen. Even in the Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll, which came out last week, it really, I think, highlighted some of his issues. There were a number of people who said that they thought he was dangerous.
6 in 10.
That is a big deal. That's a real red flag to the campaign. The other thing that I'm hearing from Trump officials is that they're very worried about their standing with white suburban women, given all of the Democrats' focus on reproductive rights and, problems of abortion access in a number of states. And so they're really worried about sort of reaching that population. And so I think that we can see some of the warning signs already. But, just with Republican primary voters, Trump remains very popular and a movement figure.
Nikki Haley was asked about the pledge on Sunday morning television, whether she would endorse Donald Trump if, in fact, he ended up being the nominee. And they had to take that pledge to get on the debate stage. Of course, Donald Trump was not one of them, and he didn't show up in any debates. She's signaling, I think we can say, that she might not be prepared to do that as the RNC takes on new leadership. Will it matter at that point?
I mean, I think that she has sort of alienated Trump's MAGA base so much that I'm really not sure if it matters if she endorses him. And I think that the people who have been funding her campaign and also supporting her, you know, a lot of college-educated, wealthier Republicans, a lot of big donors, you know, who read Bloomberg, who are in finance, support her, people who are just very loath to back Trump regardless. I feel like that's not really the audience that's going to rush to support him.
All right, Bloomberg's Nancy Cook joining us this evening ahead of a trip to Mar-a-Lago for Super Tuesday tomorrow. Thank you so much. In the meantime, Vice President Kamala Harris spoke over the weekend in Selma, Alabama, calling for a temporary ceasefire between Israel and Hamas.
Given the immense scale of suffering in Gaza, there must be an immediate ceasefire for at least the next 6 weeks, which is what is currently on the table.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's Dan Flately, who reports on national security matters for us. So, Dan, as we heard from the vice president, a 6-week ceasefire is on the table, and yet talks are not progressing because of issues including Israel's trying to verify the status of hostages held by Hamas. Just how difficult are these negotiations right now?
Kailey, these negotiations are incredibly difficult. You're still dealing with an active war zone, essentially, in Gaza. You're dealing with two sides that don't really trust each other in the Israelis and the leadership of Hamas. And you're dealing with a fraught political situation here in the U.S. where you have the Biden administration that obviously is coming under fire for not being harder on the Israeli government in terms of the humanitarian toll of this offensive in Gaza. So there's a lot of things going on in the background. The Israeli opposition leader Benny Gantz is here in Washington this week to meet with officials. There's some friction there between him and Benjamin Netanyahu. So it's a very complicated situation. There does seem to be the framework for some sort of ceasefire, as Vice President Harris mentioned, on the order of about 6 weeks. But whether they can actually reach an agreement and bring that to fruition anytime soon is very much up in the air at this point.
Dan, Israel says it will not send negotiators to Cairo to talk about a ceasefire until it gets a list of all the hostages and their conditions. Will Hamas be trusted to provide that information?
It's very difficult to say, Joe, at this point. I mean, obviously, there's a trust issue here, as I mentioned earlier, and seeing a list or seeing some sort of proof of life, so to speak, in advance of any kind of talks is paramount. But, I think from the Israeli perspective, too, even if you see that on paper, how could you really trust that, just looking at it from their perspective? And we also had a UN report recently about sexual violence on October 7th and some other sort of very, damning reports and evidence around that event. So it really has to kind of proceed in a very step-by-step basis, and you need to establish that trust. And right now, they don't have that at the moment.